So in this video, I'll tell you what the Nazis have got to do with Milgram's famous obedience experiments and why some people don't want us to think about those experiments in a particular way. Also, why ethics is not always what it appears. So all that is coming up. So I've got another video up on my YouTube channel that gives you an overview of the Milgram studies in case you're not familiar with them or you need reminding about them. And I've put another video link in the description box below to give you someone else's take on those studies. Now, most psychology students know about the Milgram study, and awareness of the study has spread beyond psychology students. It has become really well known. You know, they made a feature film about it in 2015 starring Peter Sarsgaard and Winona Ryder. It was called The Experimenter. Pretty good film, I've heard. Now, for an interesting read on Milgram and his experiments, here's a book by Gina Perry, a psychologist who lives in Melbourne. Well, last time I looked this up, she was in Melbourne. Now, there are two important findings that I didn't mention in the previous video. First, the findings from the obedience studies showed how if you increased the social distance between the learner and the teacher, for example, put them in separate rooms, obedience increased. And if you reduced that distance, for example, put the learner in the same room as the teacher, obedience decreased. And obedience also increased, this is the second point, it also increased if the experimenter's social status was increased. For example, if the experimenter wore a lab coat rather than, say, a casual jacket. There have been lots of criticisms of the findings of the Milgram study. Lots of different ways at looking at the findings and interpreting the findings. But there has been a fairly consistent response to the studies, and that was how it was criticized for being unethical. This is largely because some participants became distressed by taking part in the experiment. Participants were either not debriefed or were poorly debriefed afterwards.
Work for a doctor, he told you to give a hypodermic to a patient, even though the patient protested, well, you might have to do it.
And participants didn't give their informed consent as they were misled about the nature of the experiment.
We wanted to find out just what effect different people have on each other as teachers and learners.
It was also not clear that participants had the right to withdraw from the experiment, because when the participants asked for the experiment to stop, the experimenter insisted the experiment went on.
Continue, please. I'm not getting no answer. Please continue. The next word is white.
And for those reasons, Milgram's experiments have been put under intense scrutiny and have been deemed faulty and even disgraceful. And many academics have sought to discredit and disown the findings from those studies. And this still goes on today. You know, in the way that psychology tutors will talk about those studies to their students as an example of how not to conduct a piece of research. For example, this is a bad piece of research because it's unethical. Now, the question I want you to consider is whether social ethics has been invoked to cover an unsettling finding from Milgram's work, a finding that is so politically contentious that it has to be buried. Now, Milgram said in response to the criticisms about the ethics of his work that whether people knew it or not, their criticism stemmed from the results of the experiment. If everyone in the experiment had broken off at slight shock or moderate shock, i.e., that they refused to obey an instruction from someone in authority to harm another person, it would have been a very reassuring finding, and who would have protested that? And Milgram was absolutely right. Now here, you might link back to the Rosenhan paper and how that experiment was attacked for being unethical. Remember the Rosenhan experiment? The paper that we focused on for assessment 1 on this unit of study. Now, was the attack on the Rosenhan paper motivated by people who were uncomfortable with the findings of that experiment? You know, so they turned to ethical arguments to criticize the experiment. Now, Zygmund Bauman discusses this aspect of the Milgram experiments in his book, Modernity and the Holocaust. It's a book I really recommend you read at some point. You don't need it for this unit of study, but I just think it's a really good book to read. What today has Milgram's obedience studies given us in terms of understanding why the Holocaust happened? Milgram's findings are actually fairly unambiguous in relation to this. It suggested that anyone could have done what the Nazis did, that it's likely, if the conditions are right, it will happen again. This is not an easy finding to live with. It's perhaps no wonder that opinion came down against Milgram's research in full force. Milgram's research challenged a fairly deeply entrenched public opinion and academic tradition in psychology. Milgram's hypothesis was that cruelty is not committed by cruel individuals, but by ordinary men and women trying to acquit themselves well of their ordinary duties. His findings were that cruelty correlated poorly with the personal characteristics of its perpetrators, but it correlated very strongly indeed with bureaucratic structures of power and authority. Now, it's useful to contrast how Milgram's studies on obedience were received compared to those in Theodor Adorno's book, The Authoritarian Personality, which was published in 1950. Adorno's book was an attempt by a group of researchers to explain the conditions that allowed Nazism to gain a foothold in Europe by using various psychological scales to attempt to explain the Holocaust as caused by particular psychological traits of particular types of individuals. It was an individualized explanation. The propositions in that book have virtually all been discredited, but the ideas in the book were well received by the public as it located the problem of the Holocaust with the individual, not with society or with culture. It resonated with the subconscious wishes of the public at that time, who were desperate to understand the Holocaust in a way that would protect themselves from its horrors. And to identify the perpetrator as the other was a comfort. I could never do such a thing. Wicked things are done by wicked people, not by good people like me. To Adorno and his colleagues, Nazism was cruel because Nazis were cruel, and the Nazis were cruel because cruel people tended to become Nazis. Milgram offered us something different. The dismal and distressing knowledge that many gentle people may turn cruel under certain social conditions. The public and governments didn't like that explanation, so they rejected it. And we continue to reject that explanation today. Now, there have been earlier theories that suggest people, gentle people, can turn cruel. For example, Gustave Le Bon's book, The Crowd, argued that otherwise decent people could act cruelly in a crowd. But what was different with that explanation was that the crowd was the place where panic replaced command and stampede replaced authority. It was a place where people stopped behaving rationally. They stopped thinking. It was a breakdown in systems of authority, not the negative consequence of systems of authority. Also, it gave an explanation for evil being the absence of thought. The unthinkable only happens when groups of people stop thinking. And Sigmund Freud's work was popularized because it also fed into this idea that the crowds were driven by irrational desires, and his project was to help individuals control their irrational desires, that those desires had to be controlled to help bring order to society. Milgram's studies turned these ideas on their head. It obliterated the idea that humanity was fully on the side of rational order, while inhumanity was fully confined to its occasional breakdowns. He showed that our social relationships, once rationalized and technically perfected, hold the capacity for the expression of the most extreme forms of inhumanity. The Holocaust was a well-thought-out technical system of authority and control. It wasn't irrational, it wasn't people acting without thinking, it was well thought through, it was rational, and it was technical, and it was controlled. Before Milgram's experiments, few people, professionals and the public alike, anticipated what Milgram was about to discover. Virtually all were confident that all of the subjects would refuse to cooperate as the cruelty of the actions that people were commanded to perform grew. Most people believed that people would, at a fairly low point, break off, refuse to comply with the authority of the experimenter. The intensity of the alleged electric shocks they were prepared to apply was up to 3 times higher than what the learned experts in unison with the public were able to imagine. No one could have imagined that people would have done what they did in the Milgram experiments. In regards to social distance, Milgram's work helps us to understand the successive improvements in the technology of the Holocaust. At first, victims were brought in front of machine guns and killed at point-blank range, but it was exceedingly difficult for the shooters to overlook the connection between shooting and killing, and it was dangerous to the morale of the shooters. Other murder techniques were therefore sought, which led to the invention of gas chambers, which reduced the role of the killer to that of the sanitation officer, who was only asked to empty a sack full of disinfecting chemicals through an aperture in the roof of a building, the interior of which he never saw. The technical administrative success of the Holocaust was due in part to the distancing of the unsightly or morally repelling outcomes of action to the point of rendering them invisible to the actor. And Bauman sums this up thus: one of the most remarkable features of the bureaucratic system of authority is the shrinking probability that the moral oddity of one's actions will ever be discovered, and once discovered, made into a painful moral dilemma. Milgram studies showed how it was possible for a pilot to release the atomic bomb over Hiroshima, and today it shows us how it's possible for people to fly drones on kill missions. It's the invisibility of victims which is the key factor. And it's again this process whereby the self and other is pulled away from each other. The social connections between people are severed. And Bauman takes the explanation further. He writes about the moralization of technology. Here, inside the bureaucratic system of authority, morality is tied to how well you've done the job, not on how moral the job is. And as Milgram puts it, the subordinate person feels shame or pride depending on how adequately he has performed the actions called for by authority. Superego shifts from an evaluation of the goodness or badness of the act to an assessment of how well or poorly one is functioning in the authority system. I'll give you an example. Are you more worried that you've written a technically bad essay, that one that was not correctly formatted, had poor structure, didn't answer the question, or didn't cite the correct number of references, didn't use, heavens forbid, APA formatting? I know we drill it into you. You must do it. But are you more worried about that, the technical aspects of the essay? Whether the essay is technically good, technically proficient? Are you more worried about that than whether you're producing a morally bad essay? One that promotes ideas that could hurt other people. And in modern society, we find that morality is managed in a way whereby social distance is placed between us and those whom society wishes to cast aside. And most effectively, it's accomplished by labeling them as genetically inferior. It's the technique that was used against women, gay people, and against indigenous people. These people were defined with the help of psychology as genetically inferior and categorized in a way that separated them from so-called decent people. It put social distance between them and us. They are biologically different. And if you think back to when I was talking about the social self in relation to particular identities that people carried, and when we're looking at stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination, how it's at its most pernicious in categories that are defined biologically, this is why. This is what links to that material. Because defining someone as biologically different is a way of putting considerable distance between you and them. They're almost a different species. Now, this social production of distance annuls or weakens people's sense of moral responsibility towards those people. Now, I now want us to turn to the question as to whether psychologists might be the bad guys in all of this. You know, are we active in this system that produces these model sleeping pills into society, thus allowing some groups to be harmed by governments and corporations? Or are we just innocent bystanders to these social processes? Or do we just get caught up in the crossfire? What I'm asking is, have we become the bad guys because we've failed to sufficiently account for the political and cultural context of what we do? The question is whether mainstream psychology is adequately addressing these things. And I'd say no. It's up to you to decide whether it is or not. You know, but if we are not taking account of the social, political, cultural context of human behaviour, are we contributing to this process of social distancing? Now, we'll be thinking about that some more in the weeks that are remaining on this unit. And in another video, we'll also bring in a focus on Australia's eugenic policy, the policy that kind of aimed to wipe out Indigenous people in Australia. And we'll get to that connection in the week where we're looking at Indigenous psychology. So, till then, ta-da.